Good afternoon. I'm Tom Warwick, Senior Fellow and Director of the Future of DHS project here at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to the fourth in the series After the Insurrection. Today's topic is domestic violent extremism and the intelligence challenge. We're pleased to have a distinguished series of experts who will be discussing a number of aspects of this, both what happened that led up to the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, and some recommendations that could be implemented in order to try to avoid such a surprise from happening in the future. Our discussion today will be moderated by Dina Temple-Raston, a correspondent for investigations at National Public Radio and one of the most distinguished journalists in the United States on issues of national security. She's been NPR's counterterrorism correspondent for more than a decade. Has served in places such as China and the White House. She's written 4 books, including Jihad Next Door, Rough Justice in the Age of Terror, and other books about security and justice issues. She'll be introducing Mitch Silber, currently Executive Director of the Community Security Initiative, and also former Director of Intelligence Analysis for the New York City Police Department from 2005 to 2012. And then we'll have 3 distinguished commentators: Patricia Cogswell, former Deputy Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, former Acting Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security Intelligence and Analysis, former Senior Director for Transborder Issues on the staff of the National Security Council, and former Assistant Director for ICE for Intelligence at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Todd Rosenblum, who served in senior positions in both DHS, DOD, Capitol Hill, and in the intelligence community. And Karen Wagner, former Undersecretary for Intelligence Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security and a distinguished veteran of 30 years in the intelligence community at the Defense Intelligence Agency and on Capitol Hill. So we've got an excellent group of people to illuminate a number of aspects of what happened and what can be done in the future. So I will now turn it over to Dina Temple-Raston to introduce Mitch Silber. Dina, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So I wanted to explain a little bit about how it was that I came to talk to Mitch Silber about this. And that is that we have a breaking news team at NPR that put together a database that basically has everyone who has been arrested or charged so far in relation to January 6th. And it has a little description, it links to their criminal complaint, and it's searchable. So let's say, for example, you live in Pennsylvania, you put Pennsylvania into the search engine, and you can see all the cases and all the people who came from Pennsylvania who were there and have been charged so far. And our intention is to have the project actually follow everyone from charging, arraignment, through trial, and then to sentencing, so that we can get a really big picture of these 400 odd, maybe ending up being 500 people who were actually charged. So as Tom said, in my previous iteration, I was a counterterrorism correspondent. So I used to talk to Mitch Silber a lot when he was running the intel unit at NYPD. And he always had something interesting to say about the sort of trends that were coming and what we were seeing sort of unfold in terrorism as it changed and morphed. And I called him for this story about the January 6 cases because it seemed to me, as I read through them, they seemed so different. The way the whole criminal complaints were put together seemed so different from what I had experienced before when I was looking at terrorism cases. And it turns out that he was writing this report, so it was prescient that we were able to talk to each other. And that report is addressing the very issues that we were trying to look at, which was, should we be changing the way we view terrorism, national security, how our intelligence community sort of works with those issues now that we have this domestic terrorism threat that has come to the fore. And with that, what I wanted to do is introduce Mitch Silber and have him tell you a little bit about this amazing report that he wrote.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dina, for such a kind introduction. Thank you, Atlantic Council, for hosting this event, as well as supporting the report, and to Karen, Patricia, and Todd for joining our panel later today. I wanted to start with a disclaimer. In this highly politicized environment, I'm an independent, and I tried to look at this issue of January 6th from an apolitical view, really calling balls and strikes as I saw them, with really no other agenda than to try and contribute to make sure that a January 6th type event never happens again. So really the theme of today is intelligence failures. And Mark Lowenthal, a former CIA officer, explained, an intelligence failure is the inability of one or more parts of the intelligence process, collection, evaluation, analysis, production, or dissemination, to produce timely, accurate intelligence on an issue or an event of importance for national interests. Really, to distill that down, I think there are three key components of intelligence. One is you've got to collect the dots. You've got to have that acquisition of data, clues, and information from a variety of different sources. Number two, you've got to connect the dots. This is the analysis piece. How do you synthesize those signals and draw a picture of what the situation is? And thirdly, you have to provide warning. What do you do once you've drawn that picture and you think you understand the situation? Who are the policymakers that you reach out to who you present that picture to so that they can act? And really, any intelligence system's ability to complete these three tasks is the criteria in which we have to gauge their success. And when we're looking at terrorism and intelligence, we have to understand this is difficult. There aren't troop mobilizations to watch. We're not looking for ships. There are no aircraft to track. But nevertheless, when we talk about intelligence failures, I think January 6th has to be looked at in the context of other failures in American history. One, obviously, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, where part of the problem was intelligence collection. Part of the problem was sharing and coordination between Army and Navy intel. And as a result of intelligence reforms, we eventually got a central intelligence agency. Again, after 9/11, there was an intelligence failure. And after much discussion, again, intelligence reform. There, the issue was not so much collecting the dots, but it was connecting it between the wall of the CIA and the FBI. And as a result, we had the creation of the National Counterterrorism Center, Director of National Intelligence, and the Department of Homeland Security. So really that's, with that in mind, I approached this January 6th event and tried to understand three questions. Why was there an intelligence failure? Why was the US government surprised? What was the nature of it? Many have called it an intelligence failure, but what is the nature of that? It's a little bit more nuanced. And lastly, what are the fixes that you could propose, one might propose, so that it doesn't happen again? So I looked at, obviously, the January 6th event and the lead up to it and the storming of the Capitol. But because that might be a black swan event, I also looked at the 2016 to 2020 time period when you've had a rising tide of domestic violent extremism. And for those two events, those two time periods, I looked at these three criteria: collection, analysis, and warning. And how did the intelligence architecture that was created post 9/11 fare when you looked at those three criteria? Well, the first big finding is that intelligence collection did not fail. And that's good news. In fact, it was robust. Rather, the failure was in the analysis of the intelligence and the failure of government officials to issue warnings based on that intelligence. So briefly, why do I say that the intelligence collection did not fail? Well, number one, we had a number of agencies who were seeing those dots. The NYPD, who sent a packet of material to the US Capitol Police and FBI in late December, suggesting that there would be violence ahead of January 6th. Even DHS itself, Ken Cuccinelli, who was the acting deputy of Homeland Security, he told the New York Times that the Capitol Police had been given access to a channel that DHS had looked at that disseminated information from Parler, Telegram, Twitter, and the Donald.win. So he noted it was very clear the Capitol was the focus. And then for the FBI, we know that Director A was briefed in advance broadly about the online chatter, but also some of the human and signals intelligence that were coming from FBI investigations actually allowed the FBI to conduct interventions before January 6th to dissuade some of the extremists from even showing up on January 6th. And moreover, we know that FBI in Norfolk, Virginia, that office collected a particular threat report about extremists that were collecting and exchanging maps of the tunnel system for the Capitol complex. So, what happens to all of this collected intelligence? Well, according to Senate testimony from Capitol Police Chief Sund, he never saw the FBI's situational report from Norfolk. Chief Conti from DC Metro said he saw it, but it was only at 7 p.m. the night of January 5th. And we know from recent testimony that Director Wray did not see or read the Norfolk report until January 6th. But again, collection is not what failed here. So let's talk about analysis. Conventional wisdom is that in order to prevent surprise attacks, analysts have to understand and connect the dots, look at those signals, and draw a picture of the nature of the threat. Well, here the Capitol Police really shined. In fact, they wrote a very detailed 12-page report that talked about Congress being the focus of violent extremists on January 6th. The problem here, though, is that the internal analytic report wasn't shared with other law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. Now, in terms of FBI analysis, there was that singular internal FBI report, but in general, there was significant raw intelligence. And one of my key findings is that that intelligence required a more robust analytic assessment from the FBI. And this lack of intelligence was an intelligence failure. Similarly for DHS INA, they noted on January 5th, nothing significant to report, end quote. So regardless of the internal challenges at DHS and INA that Dina has reported on from NPR, their analytic cadre failed to provide a threat assessment warning based on social media and reporting in the days leading up to January 6th. So talk about warning. Chris Rodriguez, a Washington, D.C. official who oversaw the district's fusion center, said, listen, the issue here is not a lack of intelligence or a lack of intelligence information. The issue here was the inability or unwillingness for people to act on the intelligence. And here, all three agencies, the Capitol Police, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security, all failed to warn elected officials to put in position some type of security precautions that would have prevented what happened on January 6th. And the result was the worst domestic intelligence surprise for the United States since 9/11. So now briefly, what are some of my recommendations? Well, number one, I recommend the creation of a more robust online social media analysis unit to be housed inside DHS intelligence and analysis. This should be a 24/7 social media monitoring unit. Obviously, its standards will be very important to make sure that they follow constitutionally protected speech. But we need to look at social media and use that as a rich source for the collection of intelligence. When people post something, it's as if they're saying in the public square. Number two, the creation of a domestic violent extremist analysis unit. This unit would be specializing and really the central repository for the federal government, systematically collecting, analyzing, and disseminating data on acts of domestic violence. Run by a professional intelligence officer, staffed with intelligence analysts, I believe this unit should sit within the National Counterterrorism Center. Number three, this unit should have a direct report to the Director of National Intelligence. One of the things that I talk about in the report was the politicization of intelligence that happened in Department of Homeland Security, INA. And by having, besides a report to the head of NCTC, a direct report to the DNI, it would make sure that that intelligence has another route, another conduit to get out. And the last recommendation is really to create a new position. Historically, the CIA had a senior officer whose role was the warning officer. Their responsibility was to ring the bell when a threat emerged that needed to be brought immediately to the most senior staff at CIA. And based on the current intelligence community architecture, there is no role that's like that. And this is one of the things that January 6th revealed. Who was responsible for ringing the bell and saying, hey, based on the dots that we're seeing, based on the picture that it looks like, we need to take enhanced security precautions at the Capitol building. So I propose creating a new position, the Deputy DNI for warning, and this would be focused on domestic, but there probably should be someone with the same role for foreign threats as well. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitch. I have one quick question for you, and before we go to the panel. And you say that there was a failure to warn. Why was there a failure to warn?
I think it was a multitude of reasons. I think one of the reasons was that the analysis didn't present a clear picture of the nature of the threat. So without those intelligence reports in hand, I think it was difficult to warn without that sort of currency. And then I think the other piece was a lack of clarity in terms of who should be warned and whose responsibility was it. Was it the director of the FBI's responsibility, the attorney general's, the secretary of DHS? Whose responsibility is it to ring the bell when we're seeing those threats metastasizing? And I think that's one of the key reasons we need this warnings officer within DNI.
And in the absence of having this warning officer, who do you think would have been the person who should have rung the bell? I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm just wondering how it actually would have worked.
Look, FBI and Department of Homeland Security have the ability to identify an event as a national security event, and that will then justify increased security procedures. And neither FBI or DHS made that designation, for January 6th. So clearly, those two agencies, have to look inside and see why that did not happen.
Okay. So I want to bring this now out and look more broadly at this by adding our panel. And we've got Patricia Cogswell, we've got Todd Rosenblum, and we've got Karen Wagner, who's over at NIU, the National Intelligence University. So Patricia, I want to start with you if I could. Mitch suggests that having organizations that are dealing with intelligence related to domestic terrorism and domestic violence extremism report to the DNI, and sort of to wring the politics out of it. And do you think that'll work, or is that just adding more bureaucracy?
Excellent question. So I think it's important to start out with a note that by nature, intelligence analysis is intended to look at really hard problems and emerging threats and assess potential vulnerabilities and risks. Assessments are not always comfortable and may not align with what your customer wants to hear. And this is all the more so true when you are talking about domestic violent extremism or another domestic threat. The politicization concerns have increased in recent years, but DHS INA and DHS generally has faced criticism over many administrations. I would argue that's the topic, not just the organization. I think part of this is helping people understand better what the intelligence environment is intended to achieve. It's entirely appropriate for an intelligence community expects product consumers to closely examine and critique analytic tradecraft, data sources being used in the assessment, as well as appropriate for people to frankly disagree or assess data differently. That's why the intelligence community allows for dissenting opinions. So I would argue some of the other lessons we've also learned since 9/11 really look around what are the processes and training we can bring to bear that I would argue, in addition to discussions about organizational placement, are critically important. Particularly that bringing in outside entities to participate so that you have a diversity of perspectives and views being incorporated into your assessment. And I would argue you should also look to intentionally report on more than one potential outcome. We've seen over time this push to normalize around a single most likely assessment of data. In certain instances, I think it's entirely appropriate and probably much healthier for the entire community to have both most likely and worst case, so that operators can take advantage of that information and plan for both, even if they don't agree that the worst case is likely to happen. They've still planned for it. And for particularly complex problems, wargaming, being able to test out what is the likely outcome based on different types of options you might seek to take in response to a given threat. All this is to say, critically important to work on this, really important problem, and I'm grateful to be here to be able to talk about it.
So I wonder how you think the problem might be different, because now we're dealing with something domestically as opposed to the threat of what had become the other, whether it was ISIS or Al Qaeda. Even if those recruits were here in this country, we had different tools. We had, material support statutes, that sort of thing. So, and that allowed you to look for different things than you would have if you have a domestic terrorism threat. So, how does all that work differently if the threat is here?
Fantastic question. And I think this goes critically important to the discussion of who is the customer for your information. If you don't have a clearly agreed upon sort of understanding of what is your intelligence intending to incentivize or support an operator or a receiving entity to do, then you don't have a program in which to take advantage of it. Overseas, as we've noted, there's a clear expectation of either militaristic or a diplomatic intervention. Here in the United States, it's much less clear cut in a number of these arenas. We default to, frankly, a bit of a law enforcement perspective, but I'm very excited to see the recent announcement of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, the ability to bring in that wider civil society into both the discussion of what the threat is, but also the options of how to intervene prior to the actual onset of violence.
So thank you. So Todd, let me ask you. We did a story about the problems at DHS INA with regard to January 6th and how there wasn't a threat assessment put out and staffing problems that it had. Can INA be saved? Is there a way to sort of wring out some of the issues that it's had recently and have it be at the forefront of this?
Yeah, so thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. And Mitch, I think the report is tremendous. It's really well done. You get to the nub of the question, and can INA be saved? I think the answer is absolutely yes, because the mission itself is critical to be done. There are some structural challenges that INA has, no doubt. There are some structural challenges it has that don't exist elsewhere in the intelligence community. That do require, I think, a very hard look at both the size of the organization, frankly, the training and tradecraft skills of those who work there, and where it could fit a little bit more directly in support of the missions of the homeland. It's gone through various iterations of what it is. When it first stood up, it was a counterterrorism-centric entity, as the nation was. It was led by someone who was focused on the traditional foreign intelligence collection threat and analysis threat. It has gone through other changes in other directions, which have been helpful. But I do agree, INA still doesn't have a clear sense of self or purpose, but the mission itself certainly has self and purpose. So it is savable in that regard.
So Mitch was talking about social media analysis as what's done now, since you were over at INA and DHS, what's done now for a social media analysis?
So I haven't been in INA in several years now, so I'm dated in that regard. I do know the US government, though, continues to really struggle with this. It's hard for privacy protection purposes, as it should be. We live in a country where we have rules and laws that say big tech companies can have profound precision knowledge about who we are, where we are, what we're doing, where we're going, what our personal habits are, and what our choices are. We don't allow that for the government, and we don't allow that for good reason. So when we look at social media, government is at a structural disadvantage from the private sector. So I understand that people are generally frustrated. Why can't the government be better at this? And those impediments that it has to exist in are necessary and need to stay there. So, can INA or can government do better on social media analysis and use it as indicators and warning? Absolutely, and it should. And I suspect it still has a long ways to go. But also, again, to respect that it's got limitations that it won't be able to overcome because it is the government.
So Mitch, let me go back to you for just a second. Something that we used to discuss in the old days when you were in New York and I was covering terrorism was the possibility of setting up something like an MI5 here in the United States. Can you talk about, I understand why it hasn't actually happened. Does that change, do you think, what has happened post January 6th change the focus on that or the feeling about that?
Well, it certainly gets a second look, that's for sure. The reason why it came up after 9/11, the question was, well, hey, is the FBI the right agency to be looking at investigations in the homeland that are intelligence driven as opposed to law enforcement or criminal driven? And I think, at the end of the day, in spite of there being a lot of discussion about it, FBI, proved that they're very much up to the task of the investigation work and really transitioning from a purely law enforcement entity to an intelligence-driven entity. But here we are, 20 years after 9/11, a new type of threat. It's domestic, which obviously triggers a whole load of other civil liberties, civil rights concerns. And the question is, again, as the FBI is the primary collector of intelligence nationally on this, are they the right entity? And at least the conclusion I came to after looking at this was really the same one that the U.S. government came to after 9/11, is that no, we don't need another agency. We are already up to 17 agencies in the IC. So the logistics would be impossible because MI5 would be running an intelligence source, FBI would be running a criminal source. You'd have to have parallel collection tracks, and then you'd have to have all of that information sort of looked at and synchronized from an analytic perspective. Maybe the only piece that I think is worthwhile taking from that discussion and informed my recommendations is that you needed this central analytic unit, which I proposed putting it into the National Counterterrorism Center, which for the most part, their focus is external. But my suggestion is put this unit that's looking at domestic intelligence that's collected by FBI, but is analyzed by a group of analysts within NCTC who are looking more strategically. They're looking at particular groups, they're looking at patterns, they're looking at themes. They're not in the weeds of a particular case or investigation like the FBI is. And maybe that's a way where you get the benefits of an entity that's focused on intelligence without creating a whole new architecture in the IC.
Got it. So Karen, let me ask you a question. It has to do with the fact that we've always sort of felt that domestic terrorism was about law enforcement, not national security. Do you think what happened on January 6th changes that calculus?
Well, I think it proved to us that something like what happened on January 6th, that a domestic terrorist attack can be both a law enforcement criminal issue and a national security issue. And it was interesting to me, having been before I became the undersecretary at INA and a career intelligence professional, and having grown up with the wall between intelligence and law enforcement, in the wake of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, when Congress created this idea of national intelligence, which was supposed to be broader than foreign intelligence and incorporate threats to the homeland, but it was never particularly very clearly defined, and the DNI's been kind of wrestling with what that actually meant ever since. But one of the sort of bright lines that existed then, and still does to a certain degree, was domestic terrorism was off limits. So not only was the statutory language that created NCTC, it specifically precluded NCTC from focusing on exclusively domestic threats. And I know that for many years, and I don't know if this has changed, the DNI did not want Title 50 National Intelligence Program dollars spent on domestic terrorism analysis or other activities. So if we're going to take a look at changing that statute, which is something that Mitch's recommendation would require, that I suppose it could be done in a somewhat limited way to focus only on analysis, but I tend to think that it would tend to open a larger can of worms that I don't know that people are ready to open right now, and a big discussion on what is the DNI's actual role. Now, I do think that we would benefit as a community, both on the intelligence side and the Homeland Security side, in some additional clarity on roles and responsibilities in this area, particularly as we take a look at the DT piece, that probably wouldn't require a statute. I think that could be done through executive orders or some other executive level guidance and some new procedures. But I think we definitely need to be having that conversation. I know the administration is looking at that, and we need to provide some more clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities on who will do what to whom. And
let me ask you.
Okay.
Let me just ask you, just stepping back for a second, if I could. Historically, intelligence has always been better at offering a strategic warning rather than a tactical one. Is January 6th just proof of that? And how do we change that dynamic? Would, for example, Mitch's dedicated warning officer make a difference? And how do you think that might work?
Well, it's true. We've always been better at strategic than tactical. And obviously tactical is the goal because you want actionable information that you can actually deal with where and when. And I do think January 6th it sort of follows the paradigm in that you could argue the JIB that came out in December, the Joint Intelligence Bulletin, was a strategic warning. I think you could also argue there was enough additional information that came along afterwards that got us to the tactical warning point, and that we didn't actually do that. I think Mitch's idea of having an analytic unit focused on this effort is actually a really good one. And I ideally would like it to include people from FBI and DHS and the foreign intelligence community, because so many of the issues we face now, even though they're domestic issues, there tend to be foreign linkages, which we've all seen recently. And I think it would benefit from an approach that integrated activities across multiple areas. I think the DNI could enable that even without a statutory change. Perhaps this organization could reside at NCTC, but not necessarily report to NCTC. But I do think that, again, pinning the rose, as we like to say, on someone to be a warrant officer, not a bad idea. Does that person have to be in the DNI? I don't think so. But I think having someone responsible for that and for overseeing a process, a warning process that is focused on DT would be really a great improvement. And I think there are a lot of practices and procedures that we have applied in the international terrorism realm and also in the foreign intelligence realm that could apply to this problem if we just sort of migrated some of those things to that. So I do think that I like Mitch's suggestions in terms of what needs to be strengthened. I just think that there are multiple ways to achieve them, whether or not there's a statutory change.
And I just don't want it to not be noticed that we managed to get domestic terrorism and The Bachelor in the same panel. It's very hard to actually do that and pin the rose. So congratulations on that, Karen.
Well, that's actually a DoD phrase too, just
before or after The Bachelor. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is begin to take a few questions from the audience, if I could. And we have a couple of ginned up. The first from Albert Goldson. And he asks, how should the structure of the chain of command be structured to combat a future similar threat as what happened on January 6th? Someone want to take that?
I'm happy to jump in. And I guess the first thing I would say is the structural failure is government-wide. It was not at all limited to the intelligence community and not at all limited to INA. So the context of what we had was we had an intimidated intelligence unit in a pliant organization that was taking its guidance and direction from a president who was acting in a way to foster this whole incident that took place, and that therefore there was not the space for the intelligence community to do what it's supposed to do, which is to speak truth to power. But it cannot do it in isolation. It has to have structural protections around it. So it's a little hard to answer the question directly because so much of this comes back to leadership and integrity within the system. And when that does not exist, we have what happened in terms of the failure to inform and the failure to act on the information when it was informed. So other than I have enough time on Capitol Hill that I believe strongly in whistleblower protections and the ability to go to Congress and speak on to the intelligence committees where you could speak at whatever level of classification is needed. But that is a space that has to exist, and perhaps there has to be more training within the intelligence community and the executive branch writ large in terms of when you have situations in the executive branch which really run anathema to so many of us in our core belief systems, that there are alternative ways to get out your concerns and do it in official channels and do it in confidential channels.
When our story first came out about the fact that an assessment didn't come out, I got slapped around a little bit by somebody who'd been in the IC for a while, and he said, "Look, what difference would it have made if there had been an assessment? Do you think it really would have made a difference?" So I wonder, Karen, do you think it would have made a difference if there had been an assessment?
I think that's hard to know, but a lot of times when we talk about intelligence failures, what we really mean are operational failures, where the decision makers or the people responsible fail to act on the intelligence. In this case, I think we clearly, as Mitch points out in his report, we have both an intelligence failure and an operational failure. So had DHS and FBI done a better job of putting together their information, analyzing it, and issuing that warning, would that have made a difference to the Capitol Police? I don't know. There were other issues there that are not the subject of this panel, but it would have at least made it not so much of an intelligence failure, because it's pretty clear, I think, that there was enough information to do that. And to speak to the previous question for just a minute on the chain of command, while I do think it's important that you clarify responsibilities and lanes in the road, when we had the sort of classic warning issues back during the Cold War, one of the things we had was a distributed process where there was a procedure, there were stakeholders, and anybody could send up the flare. Anybody could convene a call. And I think that might be something worthwhile to consider as we look at better ways to do this in the future, to prevent the things that Todd was talking about, where you might have an institutional failure on the part of one of the people that are involved because of whatever, incompetence or political intimidation, but you don't want that to stop the whole process. You want someone else to be able to say, I want to pull everyone together and talk about this and see what we should be doing, which is what we used to do in the IT world back when I was there. If we had seen even an iota of what we saw in the lead up to January 6th involving a foreign inspired terrorism plot or group, we would have all been on secure video teleconferences talking about what we know, what we should do, and who needed to be notified immediately.
So the way I responded to this intelligence official, and I'd be interested to hear what the panel thinks, was basically, if there had been an assessment and Capitol Police had done nothing, Capitol Police would have to explain themselves, or Metro Police had done nothing, or any of these other groups had done nothing. If there was an assessment out there that says, hey, we're worried about this, and nobody was stood up, then all of a sudden, as you say, it wasn't an intelligence failure, but it also would have been, you might well have had local law enforcement saying, we've got this thing, we think they're exaggerating, but if we don't do something, they're going to pin the blame on us. And that it might have gone a long way towards that. What do you think, Mitch?
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, there were a variety of different conduits that the threat could have gone up. The flare could have gone up. DHS was one of them, FBI, and then this amazing report that the Capitol Police themselves did, which is sort of remarkable that they wrote this 12-page report that really had prescience as to what might happen. Yet they didn't operationalize their own report. They didn't share it. So I think it clearly, if the information had gone up, if the bell had been rung and the flares shot, then clearly we'd be talking about just an operational failure. And in a sense, we wouldn't be questioning whether the architecture that was put in place post 9/11 works or not, because the intelligence architecture would have proven that it works. We would just be focusing on the security piece.
Right. Well, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience about a special unit to monitor social media. And in particular, there's one here by Jeffrey Allen. And let me put this out. You can just raise your hand if you want to answer it. How would you envision the relationship between the social media monitoring agency and big tech companies that also are watching social media for example, pornography or other things that aren't supposed to be on it, or violence? Patricia, do you want to answer that?
So fantastic question. And I think if we had remotely had an idea of how to solve this, we would have solved it a while ago. It's just highlighting how difficult a question it is. I think I've seen a lot of different conversations out there around this topic and who How do we do this in the most effective way? I think it is critically important to recognize this is an all of us approach and interest. I would really emphasize something Karen said previously. In the end of the day, it's not just about the intelligence, it's about the operator and the customer. They need to send a demand signal, but they also need to be bringing their part of the game to the conversation and to the table. So to the extent that a private sector entity is the platform on which certain information is occurring that is in fact inciting the violence, they're part of the solution, and they need to be part not only of the warning, not only of telling people what information they're seeing, but also taking action to help stem it. The reverse of that is, how do we make sure that we are looking at, and I would broaden it from social media to publicly available information, how do we look at what is out there to form that strategic context, that strategic assessment well in advance, to understand what a baseline looks like, so that we can actually understand what an indicator looks like when something is moving to violence and isn't just part of the standard noise.
Karen, you were nodding. What do you think?
No, I agree with very much with Patty. I mean, this has obviously been a very controversial topic, and one of the issues that we have in the intelligence community is the issue of trust. We operate, we have kind of a contract with the public that we're going to follow the laws and do what we do under appropriate oversight. And this is an area that's always been just particularly touchy. Whatever, I agree with Patty that we have a lot of work to do to develop techniques and to figure out, to try to help us navigate the transition from constitutionally protected free speech into a crime. But I also think whatever it is that we do and however we do it, we have to be completely transparent in order to try to maintain or build up, if you will, a trust relationship with the public, that they understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, what words and indicators we're looking for, and why. And we have to make sure that we have a very robust oversight mechanism in place that is accountable. And I don't see a way not to do this, though, in the current environment, if we want to keep people safe. So we just have to kind of start doing the work.
So Todd, one of the things that you and I have talked about, and this is a question that comes off something Thomas Henke is asking, is what are the prohibitions, if any, that would prevent the public and the private sectors from collaborating on threats by domestic extremists? I mean, we've seen a little bit of this in post January 6th, and that we've seen all these tips coming in. We've seen people sending, Facebook group photographs that somebody has sent them from the Capitol and sending that on to the FBI. What active information and intelligence from public and private sector could be legally shared? And what do you think is off limits?
Well, first I'll begin with, we have a successful model in the counterterrorism world, a program called See Something, Say Something, where the public was encouraged, if they saw suspicious activity taking place at the local level, and that could be potential active shooters at schools, it could be behaviors that are expressing violence, calls to violence of neighbors or political violence, that sort of thing. There are processes by which you can report that to local authorities. Beyond that, we're talking about partnerships more than anything else. And again, as in counterterrorism, your frontline awareness occurs at the local level. And that's what we need to be fostering in this world too. It's more complicated than terrorism, because at least in traditional terrorism, at least in that context, I believe we still have most Americans not seeing that as a political my side or your side issue. In this context today, we live in a very, very different world where, not only are we staying with our own community, but we're viewing everything and anything the quote other side says as hostile, and something to be reported. So I do think we're going to struggle with this. And that was to Karen's point and to Patty's before that. The legal barriers do not exist for someone to report to local law enforcement that they see something suspicious happening. And as I said, we've got the tools to be able to do that. The application of that is really hard. And as I said before, this begins with, first and foremost, national leadership setting a tone by which we are going to be one nation, and that we have some civic responsibilities to each other. And so that fostering from the top down is really critical going forward. But I don't think this is legal inhibitors that is a real challenge here.
And so do you think that we've gotten over 200,000 different tips and Facebook images and all this other stuff has gone to the FBI because that civic responsibility aspect that you're talking about came to the fore?
Yeah, in this case, absolutely. Just like in the Boston Marathon bomber, there was crowdsourcing done by the public itself, done by individuals to help identify and aid and assist law enforcement in investigations. And that's what happened this time. Um, Now, if someone sat on a very different end of the ideological spectrum as me, they would say that it's treasonous to be sending in information about these people who attacked the Capitol. Again, separate issue, but it's some of this is where you sit. But I don't think, from certainly my vantage point, that was a public service that was done for people who are violating US law.
So one of the things that really cast a pall over the lack of assessment for January 6th versus an assessment that was done for, say, the Women's March or the Black Lives Matter marches is this idea of race and whether or not race played a role in law enforcement's response. And this comes from a question from, and I apologize in advance, Alan, if I mispronounce your name, Alan Chukwudi. And he asks, what part, if any, did race play in law enforcement's response to the organization and execution of the January 6th insurrection? And would the response have been different if the insurrectionists were Black? Anybody want to take that?
I'll start, and then others, please jump in. What from my vantage point, what we saw was a real tone set from the very top, and application of law enforcement activities that were struck me as being far more assertive and aggressive against people on one end of the ideological spectrum than on the other. That's disturbing. That's not the fair and equal application of the law, and was problematic. It's not just ideological. Obviously, we go into a whole bunch of other categories where there's unfair application of the law. But I do agree that was the case that we saw.
All right.
Dean, I would just add that, I tried to look into this issue, and it's really tough to know unless you were there, and frankly, unless you know what people who were there were thinking. And that's sort of impossible to know. I think the one thing you might say is that, look, on the operational side, if there was a lot of criticism for, police overdoing it in the summer, with the George Floyd protest activity, maybe the pendulum swung the other way. And people were then sort of, hesitant to bring that show of force to the Capitol, having received the harsh criticism, over the summer. So that's at least one, piece, one thread you might pull on a little bit.
Yeah, and we have in our reporting pulled on exactly that thread. And the June 1st clearing of Lafayette Square did pull the reins back a little bit on people, and people didn't want to overstep. And I think we heard that from Capitol Police as well. So let me slightly shift gears here, and this is from one of the anonymous attendees, and he or she asked, do the panelists believe that either a bipartisan 9/11 commission style investigation or some sort of independent investigation would be a benefit to draw further lessons from January 6th to improve the intelligence apparatus in responding to these threats? Patricia, you've been quiet for a little bit.
I would agree. I think that would make a lot of sense. Frankly, this is such a hard space, and I appreciate the significant interest from Capitol Hill and a number of other entities in trying to do their assessments. But to the greater public's interest, it's going to matter a lot that the end results are seen as nonpartisan and as open as possible. To the extent that that can be set up and supported by doing something of that magnitude, I think it could be quite helpful. Frankly, the other piece that's behind a lot of this is a useful conversation about what resources are needed to actually tackle this problem, and how much is an intelligence problem that is under-resourced, how much is it a programmatic under-resourcing of actions. And in that context, I mean, In addition to are there the right set of responsibilities and resources to an entity like DHS, but frankly, also what is the role of civil society in providing some of the solutions to this space? Are there ways that the very small grant money that goes out today to some of these entities to perform those interventions, can that be changed so that they are able to help provide a better set of solutions or a more widely available set of solutions?
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Karen?
I agree with Patty. I do think that if it could be done, to have a report from a bipartisan commission would carry a lot more weight. And I also completely agree with Patty that it should be a holistic review, not just focused on the intelligence piece, which clearly didn't cover itself with glory. But I think there are a lot of other moving parts here, and it would be helpful to look at everything.
Todd?
Yeah, I would take it even a step further and say this shouldn't be bipartisan. It should be a nonpartisan commission. And we have examples of nonpartisan commissions that have made a tremendous service to the nation. The 9/11 Commission, it wasn't just bipartisan, it was nonpartisan. The attack on the Capitol is a seminal moment in US history. And the idea that there would not be a comprehensive look about what happened and why it happened and how we could ensure or strive to ensure it does not happen again, that's something that's owed to the American people. It's owed to those who believe in democracy worldwide. And so I find it troubling and disappointing that we have these delays in even a belief that we need to have the commission. We separate out the law enforcement investigations from the commission. That's a different set of activities. But we owe this. We owe this to ourselves as a democracy and as a nation.
And just as we start to wrap this up, Mitch, I mean, one of your points in the report that I really took away was that this is a moment to turn a page, that for the last 20 years, we've been very focused outwardly on Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab or ISIS. And now it's time to look internally. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that is a really important point. And, the 20-year marker, it just happens to be sort of coincidental, but, nevertheless, it does feel like we're at this hinge moment in US history, closing the door on the post 9/11 era of jihadist threats. And now we're dealing with the threat of domestic extremism, regardless from where it's coming from on the political, spectrum. And I think there are some unique elements to that. I mean, number one is the geography. As it suggests, sort of this is a born in the USA, homegrown threat. The actors may have links overseas, but they're really US citizens. The ideologies are rooted in US history, and the political factors that drive them are things that have a US context. I think organizationally, it's also different than the Al-Qaeda and ISIS threat. I mean, those were both organizations. They had structure, they had hierarchy, orders and inspiration came down from the top. Many of the plots had sort of command and control, or with ISIS, at least remote direction, to them. But when we're dealing with this sort of domestic threat, it's really leaderless resistance. They're small groups, they're autonomous cells, they're spread around the country. And really their only connection is sort of the shared ideology and social media. And that makes it harder for traditional law enforcement techniques that are good at taking down hierarchical networks. And the last piece, which we've touched upon already, is that because it's domestic, it's a less permissive intelligence collection environment. As Brian Jenkins says, domestic intelligence collection in a democracy is a delicate undertaking. When we were investigating Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other FTOs, law enforcement had the federal material support statutes and the fact that even in the public domain and in the courts, everybody viewed that type of jihadist threat as foreign. And law enforcement had unprecedented latitude in their investigation. The chance that the 117th Congress is going to pass legislation granting broad authorities or Patriot Act 2.0, it's just not going to happen. So we have to tread carefully here.
Okay, and let me just do one quick lightning round here. We have about 5 minutes before we're supposed to close. So if there was one thing that you would suggest to get us on the right track, to be able to battle this threat in an effective way, what would it be? I'm going to start with Karen. I'm going to end up with you, Mitch.
I think Mitch's idea of creating a beefed up analytic unit, again, that has broad participation from the stakeholders and from the FI community would go a long way towards helping us do a better job of understanding and communicating and warning the threat.
And would you have some sort of IG or watchdog group making sure that they weren't maybe getting chalk on their cleats when they got close to the First Amendment issues?
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the open questions still is under whose direction and authority would this be done? And I tend to think, again, absent that statutory change allowing NCTC and the DNI to take it on, that it would make more sense for it to belong to the Bureau, but with a heavy DHS presence. And one of the challenges that we have had in the past and we continue to have is cooperation between the FBI and DHS. And you see it even here, you know, DHS didn't get the report. You know, would that have made a difference? I don't know, but it might have changed the calculus. I would really like to put those people together in a sort of a unified command structure and have the DNI and NCTC, as it has been doing, really supporting them to make any foreign linkages that need to be made, but to help them with tradecraft and procedures. And then it would come under the oversight of existing departmental IGs and intelligence oversight operations. And perhaps you would even want to appoint a specific IG official to oversee it. That would not be a bad idea.
Okay. What do you think, Patricia?
So I'll keep emphasizing the importance of understanding what programmatically we want to try to do in this space as a country, and therefore aligning the intelligence to support those programmatic needs and outcomes. Mitch talked about the fact that we have existing processes. We have the NSSE. We have the ability to issue NTAS bulletins to provide that strategic context and warning. But all of those are not in place if you don't have a customer who has a plan to do something with the information, hasn't already pre-thought all that out, isn't ready to receive the information. So you have to have both sides ready to go to attack and be ready for this problem.
And Todd, what do you think?
I think two quick things: leadership and accountability. Leadership in our system of government. Our system is predicated on leadership following a set of norms, principles, and practices that allow the intelligence community to have the space to do the reporting it should do. And you know, that gets violated. This isn't the first time it's been violated. But when the leadership itself collapses in its roles and responsibilities, the rest of the system doesn't hold either. Accountability is recognition that this was failure, again, up and down the chain. It was failure in the intelligence community. It was failure in the policy community. And so everyone needs to be looking reflectively about roles and responsibilities. So I don't want to sound defensive of the intelligence community, because, you know, I will point to the January 5th DHS memo as about as egregiously bad as you can be the day before the attack.
Right.
But this is not an INA or a DHS or an intel community failure only.
Right. And finally, Mitch, if you can just bring it home for us here, since we're coming to the end of our time together. You've suggested quite a number of things that we might do. If you only get one, what would it be?
Wow, that's tough. You're making me choose among my
Choose your
four.
children. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think I'm an analyst at heart, so I'm going to go with the analytic unit as my one primary. And I think it's key, though. It's really, I feel strongly it can't be inside DHS or FBI. It really has to be at some type of neutral territory. Maybe there are complications, you know, with NCTC, as Karen suggested, so maybe in DNI. But I think, you know, we don't want the intelligence to get stuck inside a certain agency. And, you know, from my standpoint, I've seen that happen before. If you're not inside that sort of, you know, membrane, the information, you know, doesn't go out from that.
Great. Thank you.
And then last, just to wrap up, I just want to thank Dina for hosting. You know, Patty and Todd and Karen for being part of the panel. Most importantly, the Atlantic Council, Tom Warwick and Josie Palaio for their support on the project, and Will Wexler. It's been fantastic working with you all, and so glad we could talk about these key issues, on this medium like this. So thanks, everybody.